Alright guys, welcome to Lab 3. This week we're going to talk about the anatomy of the blood vessels. So we're going to leave the heart for the time being, having discussed the anatomy of the heart and the electrocardiogram. Now we're going to move into both the systemic and pulmonary circulation, talk about some of the characteristics of the vessels, and certainly identify some of the gross anatomy of the blood vessels. And so the overview for this week then, the first thing we're going to do is describe some of the characteristics of arteries and veins. And in that, we're going to need to discuss the tissues that make up the vessel wall. We'll look at the different structure, the differences in structure between arteries and veins, and so how do the vessel walls differ. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about the functional differences between the two. And we'll touch on a lot of this stuff in lecture as well. Following that, we'll list and identify the major arteries of the systemic circulation and indicate which regions of the body are supplied by each. So leaving the heart, how do those arteries branch and how do we get from point A being the heart, to point B being a specific tissue maybe, or a specific muscle? How is the blood, what is the path of blood to that point? And then from that point back towards the heart, we're going to list and identify the major veins of the systemic circulation, as well, of course, as indicating which body regions are drained by each of those veins. And then lastly, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the pulmonary circulation. So that circuit of, the circuit leaving the right side of the heart, going towards the lung for the blood to be refreshed, coming back to the left side, ultimately to be pumped through the systemic circulation. Okay. So let's start then by just doing a quick walkthrough of what are the vessels in the systemic circulation and what is the pathway from the heart back to the right, or from the left ventricle specifically, back to the right atrium. So if we start in the left ventricle, again talking systemic circulation only, that blood is pumped into the aorta and travels through successively smaller arteries that branch and reach all parts of the systemic circulation. And we'll talk in a second just how extensive that branching is. Okay? At the end of the arteries are vessels called arterioles, which lead ultimately to capillaries that form capillary beds. And again, there's an extensive amount of branching from the arteries to the arterioles, ultimately to the capillary beds where exchange takes place. And so the capillary beds lie within the tissues being supplied. And these are the sites for exchange between the cells and the blood. And these exchange sites are set up so as to minimize diffusion distance between the blood and the cell membrane, and so the exchange of materials, be it carbon dioxide or oxygen or glucose or what have you, is more efficient. Leaving the capillaries, now coming back towards the heart, the capillary beds drain into vessels called venules, which in turn empty into veins. And the veins, draining all the regions of the blood, ultimately converge into either the inferior or the superior vena cava, ultimately, of course, emptying into the right atrium. That blood is then pumped through the pulmonary circulation to be refreshed, to come back to the left ventricle, ultimately to be sent through the systemic circulation again. And so I always get asked, well, how many vessels are there? How many capillaries are there in the human body? Well, let's talk about how extensive this branching is. Okay, so there's one aorta that leaves the left ventricle. That aorta will give rise to 160 arteries that will feed all parts of the body. From each of those arteries will be about 350,000 or so arterioles. So if you do some quick math, yep, that's about 57 million of those. So 57 million arterioles in the body. Now take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. These are estimates. Highly educated guesses is what we'll call them. Okay. Now each arteriole branches into about 400 capillaries. Do a little bit of math there, and yep, that's about 22.8 billion. Billion with a B capillaries in the body. That's a pretty astounding number if you stop to think about it for a second. Now each venule, now on the drainage side coming back towards the heart, each venule is fed by approximately 18 capillaries. And so there are about 1.3 billion of those. And then each vein in turn is fed by about 6 million venules. And there are 204 veins, ultimately converging into the two vena cava, inferior and superior, returning to the heart. Pretty crazy, right? That's a lot of blood vessels. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the tissues in the blood vessels, or what makes up the vessel wall. And so, with the exception of the capillaries, the walls of the blood vessels have three main layers of tissue. The first, the tunica intima, or interna, is the lining of the lumen of the blood vessel. So the lumen is the hollow portion, or the inside of the blood vessel. Now, the tunica intima is composed of a single layer of endothelium, and that endothelial layer is simple squamous epithelial tissue. And that layer lines the entire cardiovascular system. So all of the vessels have this, and it's continuous with the endocardium. So that layer of epithelial tissue that lines the inside of the heart. Now, when you go to the capillaries, this is the only layer of tissue that you'll find. And so really, the capillaries are a tube made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue, which is ideally suited for its exchange role. Moving from the lumen towards the outside of the vessel, so the internal layer of the blood vessel is the tunica media, which is composed primarily of smooth muscle and elastin. So it's got an ability to contract or relax the smooth muscle, which will change the diameter of the vessel itself. And that's controlled primarily by sympathetic nervous activity. This is especially important in the arterioles, because what this will do is change resistance in the cardiovascular system. And if you remember from lecture a while back, small changes in radius can lead to pretty significant changes in resistance. And the arterioles are really important in that job. And this is one of the main mechanisms by which we control blood pressure. And so we'll refer to this quite a bit as we move through the course, and certainly when we talk about blood pressure control. Now, the elastic component is important, especially on the arterial side. As the blood fills the arteries, it allows them to expand and then recoil and help propel the blood through the circulation. Now, there'll be different different amounts of these tissues depending on where in the cardiovascular system you are, and I'll try to point out some of those differences in a few minutes. And lastly, on the most external part, or furthest away from the lumen, or furthest away from the blood, is the tunica externa, or adventitia, which is composed of areolar and fibrous connective tissue. And so a lot of collagen there, performing a supportive and protective function. Now, if we look here at a diagram of these blood vessels, on the left here, obviously, we've got an artery. On the bottom of this diagram is a vein, or pardon me, a capillary, and on the right side, a vein. And if you look just at sort of the exploded view of these vessels, you can see that the composition of the vessel wall is very different depending on which vessel we're talking about. And so if we start here at the top of the diagram, at the tunica intima, so the innermost layer of tissue, or that layer of tissue that is in direct contact with the blood or in the lumen of the vessel, if you go down to the capillary again, here you see where my cursor is, that capillary is just endothelial, just a layer of endothelial cells. And so you also see here in the artery and the vein layers of endothelium. Now those sublayers, subendothelial layers in both vessels vary in thickness depending if you're in the artery or the vein. And then there's also, you notice on the arterial side, an internal elastic membrane as part of the tunica intima. And so that gives the artery a little bit more elastic properties than the vein. Moving down the diagram here, or towards the inner portion of the vessel wall, is the tunica media. So you see on the arterial vessel here, on the artery, that's much thicker than on the vein, and absent, of course, in the capillary. Now that layer contains smooth muscle and elastic fibers. Again, the smooth muscle's role is to help change the diameter of the vessel, and the elastic fibers help the vessel recoil after it's been filled with blood. And there are varying roles for those tissue types if you're talking about arteries versus vein. And certainly when we talk about control of blood flow in lecture, we'll talk about the importance of those tissues quite a bit. Moving down again to the tunica externa, again that outermost layer composed primarily of collagen fibers, playing protective and supportive roles for the blood vessel. One more thing I want to point out before we leave this diagram. If you look down on the right side here where my cursor is, you notice that there are valves in the veins. Now these valves promote one-way flow. In fact, don't promote, they ensure one-way flow of blood through the veins back towards the heart. So they prevent backflow. And I'll explain how we can take advantage of those valves in a couple minutes to help return blood to the heart. So looking at a microscope slide here of the histology of the blood vessels. On the left, we have an artery, and on the right here you see this irregularly shaped vein. Now the shape of the vein here you see is not perfectly round. You'll see that quite a bit in veins, largely because the vessel wall is so much thinner. It's at the mercy or is influenced, I should say, maybe more correctly, by the surrounding tissue a little bit more. But the first thing you should notice is the thickness of the vessel wall. And so on the left side here, looking at the artery, here you see here the lumen, and then here the tunica media, and then the tunica externa, or the adventitia. You notice that those layers are much thicker than those two layers here on the vein. You also notice that the lumen of the artery is a little bit more narrow than the lumen of the vein. So the vein has a slightly larger diameter than the artery. What you don't see here is the tunica intima, or that innermost layer of tissue. If you wanted to get a really good look at that, you're going to have to take the microscope, put it to a higher magnification, and then you'll be able to identify that thin layer of epithelial tissue that lines the lumen. So when you get to lab this week, pull out a microscope, find a slide of the vessel, and try to find examples of arteries and veins in different tissues in your slide box. Okay, so just to further explain the structure of the blood vessels a little bit, here's a figure I've stolen from your textbook, and this is something that we'll touch on in lecture a little bit, but I want to spend more time on it now than maybe in lecture in a week or two. And so here we have a chart that's going to show differences or different structures and features between arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. The first comparison is based on diameter. So how wide is the vessel? The second is the thickness of the wall. And then the third here shows the relative distributions of endothelial tissue, elastic, smooth muscle, and fibrous tissue that compose the vessel wall. And so the first one here are the arteries. Now this would be an average artery. So this is a little bit different than the aorta, and so it would be a little smaller than the aorta, but a little bit larger than, say, something that was just about to turn into an arteriole. So an average artery. Now, arteries are high pressure vessels, and they always carry blood away from the heart. And you notice here that there is a layer of endothelial tissue and a pretty significant amount of both elastic and smooth muscle tissue. Again, the smooth muscle plays a role in altering the diameter, and when we're talking about altering the diameter of the arteries and really more importantly the arterioles, we're affecting resistance to flow. The elastic tissue is really important in the arteries because what's going to happen in the arteries as the ventricle contracts, fills the arteries with blood, they will expand. So during ventricular systole, the arteries expand, but during ventricular diastole, so when the ventricles relax, you get recoil of the arteries, and that blood that has filled them will be propelled towards the arterioles and the capillaries. So in a sense, it acts as a secondary pump. Moving to the arterioles, you notice that the mean diameter has gone down considerably, so much narrower vessels, and the wall thickness is much thinner than in the arteries. And when you look at the composition of the wall, you notice again that endothelial layer that is continuous throughout the cardiovascular system. Excuse me. But you note the absence of elastic and fibrous tissue. But there is a considerable amount of smooth muscle, and when you compare it to the overall thickness of the wall, a very large amount of smooth muscle. In fact, the vessel wall is mostly smooth muscle. And so these are what we call our resistance vessels. That the wall is primarily smooth muscle means we have a really large capacity to change the radius of these vessels. And remember, small changes in radius will alter resistance in a big way. And so these are the vessels that are of primary importance in controlling resistance in the cardiovascular system. And controlling resistance in the cardiovascular system is one of the key mechanisms by which we control arterial blood pressure. And so we're going to talk a lot in lecture about how we manipulate the diameter of these vessels and the effect that has on blood flow distribution and on blood pressure. Okay, now moving to the capillaries, you notice that the vessel diameter is really narrow, about 8 micrometers in diameter. So really narrow vessels. The wall thickness, very thin, and really it's just that one thin layer of endothelial tissue. Okay, and that makes it perfect for exchange. Very minimized diffusion distance from the inside of that vessel to the outside of that vessel. Now, these are the narrowest vessels in the body. In fact, they're only wide enough to fit one red blood cell through at a time. Now, if we look at the capillaries a little more closely, again, this is another diagram I've stolen from your textbook. You often hear us refer to capillaries as forming these capillary beds. And this is what I mean by a capillary bed. Really, you've got sort of this web-shaped or this network of capillaries that extends from the arterioles towards the venules. And so in these white spaces here, you could envision that there would be cells that are being supplied by the venules, or pardon me, by the capillaries. And so you get exchange across the wall of the capillary with those cells. Now, if you look at a photomicrograph of the capillary in cross-section, this is what it looks like. And so if you follow my cursor here around this vessel, so that's the outer diameter, or the circumference, of the capillary. And what's been colored in red here are red blood cells. They have that sort of that concave look to it. They're really biconcave discs. But if you look at them, literally there's not much more room in that vessel than there is enough for that red blood cell to flow through. And so these red blood cells literally line up one after another to flow through the capillary, and the purpose of the red blood cell really is to drop off oxygen at the tissues. So you get diffusion of oxygen out of the capillaries, and carbon dioxide will be coming in from the tissues to be carried into the veins, ultimately back towards the lungs to be exhaled. Okay. Moving forward to the venules, so the capillaries drain into the venules. The venules are obviously greater in diameter than the capillaries. The vessels are now going to get progressively larger as we move back towards the heart, and the wall will be a little bit larger as well, but the wall on the venous side is thinner than the walls on the arterial side. And if you look at the venules, certainly compared to the arterioles, you notice that the wall is much thinner, and there is there's a little bit of fibrous tissue, and you notice no elastic or smooth muscle tissue. Now, as you get to the end portions of the venules, you'll start to see a little bit of smooth muscle start to appear and a little bit more elastic tissue, and ultimately those will lead to veins. And if you look at the veins, the largest veins have the greatest diameter, but the wall is pretty thin, and there are some mechanisms by which we take advantage of that to help return blood back to the heart. So the combination of the thin wall and the valves I talked about earlier help us get blood back towards the heart. I'll talk about that in just one second. But again, if you look at the distribution of tissue here through that vessel wall, again, that layer of endothelium that is continuous throughout, and then a certain amount of elastic, smooth muscle, and fibrous tissue, but less elastic and less smooth muscle tissue than in the arteries. And so they're not going to recoil to the same degree as you'll see an artery after it's been stretched. And they certainly don't have the same amount of smooth muscle, and so you wouldn't expect the same changes in diameter. And when we talk in class about return of blood to the heart, we'll talk about why the smooth muscle on the venous side is so important, and helps with what we call venous return, getting blood back to the heart from the periphery. Now, one of the other things that helps with venous return, or getting blood back to the heart through the veins, are these one-way valves. Now, one of the issues in the veins is that the pressure is really low. Again, if you remember from one of the first lectures of the semester, we talked about how the pressure drops throughout the cardiovascular system. And so the veins don't have a high driving pressure getting blood back to the heart. And it's especially difficult if you're standing up versus lying down, because now you've got to also work against gravity. So if you're coming from the lower extremity back towards the heart, you've got a bit of a challenge to return blood. Now the one-way valves assist in this to a great deal. Now this is another diagram from your textbook. I have to start by saying that this diagram has a giant vein that runs in between the medial and the lateral head of the gastrocnemius muscle. This is not a real vein. This vein doesn't exist, but it does illustrate how these valves work. The valves take advantage of what we call the skeletal muscle pump. And so because the vessel walls are so thin, they're subject to forces from outside of the vein. And so as the muscle contracts, say you're walking, for example, that vessel will be compressed by the skeletal muscle, the rhythmic contractions of the skeletal muscle. Well, it squeezes on the vessel, and because of the valves, will propel blood back towards the heart. So you notice here, this valve has opened, and blood is moving back towards the heart. Oops. Sorry about that. So blood is moving back towards the heart. Now, if you notice the valve here below where that contraction takes place, the cusps of that valve shut. So it prevents flow of blood back towards where it's coming from. So it works a lot like the semilunar valves do in the heart. So we'll talk a lot about this in terms of venous return in lecture and how important the skeletal muscle pump is in ultimately helping with cardiac function as we move through the course. Okay, so switching gears a little bit here. Now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the vessels, and we're going to start with the systemic arteries of the body. So you're going to be responsible for identifying the major systemic arteries in the body in the following regions. First, the arteries of the head and neck. And so if you look at figure 32.3 in your lab manual, would be a good start. Of course, you're going to want to use the visible body software to help you with this. We're also going to look at the arteries of the upper limb and thorax, so figure 32.4, arteries of the abdomen, figure 32.5, and arteries of the pelvis and the lower limb, which is found in figure 32.6. But like I said, you're going to also want to use the visible body software to help you fill out the workbook. Now, you're also going to want to use the workbook to determine which vessels you're responsible for identifying. Not all of the vessels in the lab manual are found in the workbook. So identify the vessels that are in the workbook and identify the area that are supplied by each. Okay? Now to help you with this, you're going to want to look at the schematic of the systemic arterial system that is shown in figure 32.2 in your lab manual. And really what this is it's almost like a roadmap through the arterial system. And so this obviously doesn't really look like the anatomy of the vessels, but it's arranged in order. And you might find it easier to remember these vessels if you remember how they branch off of each other. And so if you start, at the heart, so we've got here the left ventricle. Immediately leaving the heart, the first vessels that branch are the coronary vessels that feed the myocardium of the heart. We learned that a couple weeks back when we talked about the anatomy of the heart itself. The ascending aorta gives way to the arch of the aorta. The arch of the aorta then occurs in posterior of the heart through the thoracic aorta all the way down to the diaphragm, and then turns in to the abdominal aorta, ultimately going to feed the lower limb. And you see here all the branches off of the aorta. And so if we go back to the arch, we see here the first vessel off of the arch of the aorta is the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, you remember that again from when we talked about the anatomy of the arch of the aorta. Now that name, brachiocephalic, if you did your job back, I think it was the first lab in September when we started talking about anatomy, or the language of anatomy, and the words we use to describe different regions of the body. If I told you after that, oh, there's a vessel called the brachiocephalic trunk, you should have immediately said, oh, it probably goes to the arm and to the head. And so if you remember the lexicon that we used back then, it's going to make your task incredibly more simple in trying to remember all these vessels. What you're going to find is that as you go through this, the names that you used in that first lab are the same sort of words that you used when we described the skeleton, which are the same words we used when we described the musculature, which are the same words we used when we described the nervous system. Well, we're going to do it again with the blood vessel. And so pay attention to those words because they're going to tell you where that vessel goes. Okay, so brachiocephalic, leading to the right side of the body, off of the arch of the aorta. Again, the next vessel is the left common carotid. And so there's a bit of a distinction here you need to make between right and left sides of the body. And if you look in your workbook, there was a note there to make to take care to note some of the differences between the right and the left side of the body. So you notice here that the right common carotid comes off the brachiocephalic. The left common carotid comes off directly off of the aorta. The third vessel off the arch of the aorta is the left subclavian artery. The right subclavian artery also comes off the brachiocephalic trunk, just like the right common carotid. And so the right and left side is a little bit different there, but from there on out, from the subclavian and the common carotid, the vasculature mirrors itself on both sides of the body. And when you go through the diagrams in the book, you're going to see that it's predominantly just the right side of the body that's shown. Know that the left side is almost always exactly the same, but there are some distinctions that you're going to want to be aware of. Okay, and so I'm not going to go through this whole diagram, but you sort of get the gist that these are the major vessels in the body that give rise to all of these arteries that we're going to be worried about identifying. And so you get out here, let me just follow through to the right side in the upper arm, and I'm going to give you an example in a sec. So from the brachiocephalic to the subclavian below the scapula, below the clavicle, towards the axillary artery, and then to the arteries of the upper limb. Okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use two examples, and I'm going to help you trace a drop of blood, and in doing that, walk you through the vascular tree to that tissue. And one of the examples I'm going to use is the brachioradialis muscle. The brachioradialis is in the forearm. If you don't remember exactly where it is, now's a good time to stop the video, flip back through that exercise, and identify exactly where it is. The other example I'm going to use is the soleus muscle. Soleus muscle, again, if you don't remember where that is, now's a good time to stop the video and go identify where that muscle is. Here's a hint. It's in the lower limb. And so coming down the aorta, through the common iliac artery, into the arteries of the lower limb. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show you how we're going to identify these vessels. And really the ultimate goal here is to be able to trace blood around the body. And so if I say, how does blood get from the left ventricle to the brachioradialis muscle, I want you to be able to trace that drop of blood. Same would be true to the soleus. So I'm going to use those two as examples. Okay? So here is a diagram from your textbook. This is figure 32.4. Okay? Now that I know you've all gone back to find the brachioradialis muscle, you all remember it's in this neighborhood, right? So in the forearm. So our task then is to figure out, well, how does blood get from point A to point B? And so left ventricle obviously is where the blood is going to start. It's going to go through the arch of the aorta to the brachiocephalic trunk. From the brachiocephalic trunk, it will flow to the right subclavian artery. Again, I'm going to the right side of the body here. The right subclavian artery gives rise to the axillary artery. Now you're going to want to use the visible body software here and follow these vessels by highlighting them one at a time all the way down to the target. And when you highlight the vessel, it's going to tell you where the borders of these vessels are. So you notice that the right subclavian and the axillary artery are continuous with each other. But you're going to have to be able to identify where that vessel starts, being called the subclavian, and where it starts, being called the axillary. The axillary then gives rise to the brachial. Again, you're going to want to determine where the borders of those vessels are. The brachial artery then bifurcates right here at the elbow into the radial and the ulnar artery. The brachioradialis, obviously being on the radial side of the forearm, is fed by the radial artery. Okay, so that's just one brief example of how you're going to go about learning all of these vessels. And again, you notice all these vessels on here are also on your workbook. And so you're going to want to do exercises like this for most of these vessels to help you be able to identify them. Now, if I go to the lower limb, I've already used the schematic, right? We've gone from the aorta, through the descending aorta, through the thoracic region, through the abdomen, and now we've come down to the common iliac artery, which is right here. Oh, sorry, in case you forgot where the soleus was, it's on the posterior aspect of the lower leg. So this is again the right leg. So common iliac artery here, giving rise to the external iliac artery, which in turn gives rise to the femoral artery. Okay, femoral artery, as you might imagine, travels next to the femur. The femoral artery gives rise to the popliteal artery, and if you look here on the left side of this diagram, or the anterior view, you notice that the popliteal artery goes posterior to the knee, and it comes here. Now I'm on the right side, which is a posterior view, coming posterior of the knee, giving rise to both the fibular and the posterior tibial artery, and it's the posterior tibial artery that supplies the soleus muscle. Again, go through the workbook. You're going to look at all the vessels you're responsible for, but exercises like this are really going to help you understand the pathways that the blood can take through the arterial system, and in doing that, it's going to help you identify these vessels. Now you notice I didn't put in the head and neck or the abdomen region here. You're going to want to do similar exercises for those to be able to identify those muscles. Or not muscles, sorry, those vessels, obviously not the muscles. Okay, now that you've got the arterial side figured out, the venous side is going to be very similar, so I'm going to ask you to go through the exact same process. And so, again, you're going to be responsible for identifying major systemic veins in those same regions that we just talked about. And so I've listed some of the figures from your lab manual here. But again, going to want to use the visible body software as well. Use the workbook to determine which of those vessels you're responsible for. And rather than talking about which areas are supplied, we're really talking about which areas are being drained by these veins. And again, the schematic of the veins for the body that's shown in your lab manual will help you out and go through this same exercise in learning how to identify where all of these vessels are, paying very close attention to the naming of the vessels, and again, relying on your the work you've already put in terms of remembering the regions of the body and what they're called. And so again, similar idea here to what we showed in the schematic with the arterial side. I'm going to ask you to use those two examples I just used, brachioradialis and soleus, two random examples. It's not like they're my favorite muscles or anything, but I want you to just use those two, and in using this schematic, trace the blood back to the heart. Okay, so you're going to want to take that, take those two muscles, go to the diagram of the anatomy here, or use the visible body software and trace it back. So again, remember brachioradialis here, right on the radial side of the forearm. Trace that blood back towards the heart. You'll notice that the anatomy of the vessels on the venous side is similar, but a little bit different than on the arterial side. And sometimes on the venous side, there's more than one possible route for a drop of blood to take back to the heart. So make note of some of those. Okay, but again, you'll notice that the vessel names correspond to where they are in the body for the most part. Some of them are a little bit different. For example, you notice here, one of the vessels, the veins that runs down the lateral portion of the arm, is called the cephalic vein. Now, one would think that should be associated with the head, but there's a little bit of a funny story as to why it's called that. So I'll let you investigate that on your own. Suffice to say, it was lost in translation, way back when. Latin's not that easy, you know. And so again, here we go, vessels of the lower limb. Again, going from the soleus here back towards the heart. Take the time to go through and identify these vessels as you move back towards the heart, making note of the potentially different routes you can take on the venous side. Again, you notice that I didn't include in the presentation the head and neck or the abdomen or the hepatic portal circulation. So I'm going to ask you to go to the lab manuals and examine those figures. And again, use the visible body software to navigate your way through that. All right, the last thing we want to talk about today is the pulmonary circulation. So the pulmonary circulation is the circulation, obviously, that leaves the right ventricle. So we're talking about the pumping of deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk, and ultimately we're going to get it to travel to the right and left lungs to be reconditioned or aerated. It gets to the lungs by way of the left and right pulmonary arteries. Certainly we've talked about this already when we talked about the anatomy of the heart. Now the pulmonary arteries themselves enter the lungs and then divide further into lobar arteries. Now the lobar arteries feed the lobes of the lungs, and there are 3 lobes in the right lung and 2 lobes in the left lung. And so there are 3 lobar arteries on the right lung, or in the right lung, and 2 on the left. And we'll talk about the lobes of the lung in greater detail when we talk about the anatomy of the lungs in a couple weeks' time. The lobar arteries themselves extend throughout the lungs, excuse me, and branch extensively, leading to arterioles, which feed the capillary networks which surround the alveoli of the lungs. Now, the alveoli are the air sacs of the lungs, so they fill with air, and they're literally surrounded by these capillary beds, and you get gas exchange at those sites. And so the deoxygenated blood is coming back to the lung, and it's got a substantial carbon dioxide content because it's coming from the metabolically active tissues in the periphery. The carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveolus to be exhaled, and the blood picks up fresh oxygen from the blood from the air that you've breathed in to the alveoli. So the blood returns back to the heart with a greater oxygen content. So oxygenated blood drains from the capillaries into the venules, which ultimately form to converge into the 4 pulmonary arteries, so 2 on the right side, 2 on the left side, again returning that oxygenated blood to the left atrium, which is distributed ultimately to the systemic circulation. Now the lung tissue itself also has a blood supply requirement, right? It is living tissue, has an oxygen requirement, but it itself is not fed by the pulmonary circulation. In fact, the tissue of the lungs is fed by the systemic circulation by way of the bronchial arteries, which branch off the descending aorta. Okay, if we look at a quick diagram here of the pulmonary circulation, again starting on the right side of the heart, so right atrium here into the right ventricle, that deoxygenated blood, which is always by convention drawn blue, leaving through the pulmonary trunk, going to by way of the pulmonary arteries. So here, left pulmonary artery, here the right pulmonary artery into the lungs. In the right lung, you see the branching here to the 3 lobar arteries. So this goes to the superior lobe, this branch right here, this branch right here going to the medial, this branch here, going to the middle lobe, and this branch here also feeding the middle lobe and going all the way down to the inferior lobe. On the left side, you see here there are 2 branches, one branch going here to the superior lobe, and this other branch that feeds the lower portions of the superior lobe as well as the inferior lobe. Okay, so and then of course drainage of that blood in through the pulmonary veins, which in this case is drawn as red blood, which indicates it's been oxygenated, back into the left atrium here, into the left ventricle, to be ejected through the aorta and then through the systemic circulation and all those arteries you're going to spend all that time this week identifying. Okay, so that's your task for this week. Come to lab prepared and ready to revisit again some of the terms and language you used in the first semester to identify regions of the body, and that's going to help you extensively with understanding and learning the vessels of the body. So here's another sort of deconstructed view of the cardiovascular system. When I first saw this, I thought the arterial side was waving goodbye to you. Turns out if you really look at it, the way the thumb is positioned, I think the person's just looking at his hand. But with that, I'll say goodbye, and we'll pretend that he's waving goodbye to you too. We'll see you next week in lab, guys.